Hello, everybody. My name's Ashwin Siby,
I'm Rudolph.
and we're going to be doing a presentation on answering the impossible questions. So, have you guys ever presented or ever talked about your research? And did someone ever ask you a question that kind of made you go like this? I'll start with talking about settings. So, you can be asked all sorts of questions at any setting, from more formal settings, such as presenting your poster, or to a more casual conversation. And because of this, it's important to be able to be prepared to explain your work to a wide range of people in different scenarios. For example, in a more formal setting, such as a conference, you might be interacting with people who are working in the same or a relatively similar field who may ask different questions than your friends and family when they ask you, what do you do? The first thing to know when asked a question about your work is to kind of know the people behind it. Everyone has a different level of understanding when it comes to specific fields of scientific research. There are people who have little to no background in science, but are still curious, to people who are more familiar with scientific research, but not specifically in your field. Then you have the experts in your field. And the challenge is being able to answer questions and explain your work that is tailored to each person's background. Your average person has little to no scientific knowledge, but they still pay the taxes that fund your research. That's kind of why it's important to explain the significance and the impact of your research to these people in terms that they can understand. One thing you can tell them is, how could your research affect their life? And it's important to explain the overarching goals and history of your research to these people, not the complex, intricate systems that you deal with on a day-to-day basis. Talking to someone who has a limited knowledge of science is similar to talking to your average person. This person tends to know science on an introductory level and could be a high schooler or an early college student. You can still use simpler terms, but keep in mind that you can explain simple experiments alongside their goals. Also, it can be helpful to use analogies to explain a more complex, abstract idea into a more familiar one. Finally, you should avoid using technical jargon that is specific to your field.
One common way of explaining science to people that aren't familiar with your specific field is using analogies. And a lot of you have probably used analogies to explain your research in the past, but the basic idea is using like common terms or things that the average person will understand and drawing a comparison to your research. So for example, an analogy that I often use is I work in brain stimulation. So I'll make the analogy of muscle memory, because most people know what muscle memory is from playing an instrument or playing a sport. And so basically what we try to do is stimulate people's brains to kind of get the brain going again and build muscle memory. So then later, if someone was having like memory problems, their brain knows what to do after we stimulated it. Some research doesn't always require an analogy. You can just simplify your terms. So this is just basically explaining what you're doing without being all technical, and you don't have to be 100% correct with what you're saying. Like I said, I work in brain stimulation. So I tell people that I zap people's brains with magnets and it makes them smarter. And that's not exactly what I do, but for just the average person, if I'm talking to my grandma or something, then that's all they really care to hear. And that will be enough to get them interested in it. So now Ashwin's going to post a Qualtrics survey in the chat, and we're going to ask you to try to explain your research project in the simplest possible terms that you can use.
So while you guys go ahead and answer that, I'll kind of answer the question. The lab I work with studies a protein called DED1 in yeast cells. DED1 has a lot of important functions in the cell, and the human version of DED1, a protein called DDX3, has been linked to many viral diseases and cancers. Because of this, it's important for us to understand the mechanisms behind DED1 in yeast, so we can use it as a way to better understand and translate what happens in humans.
Another kind of person you'll talk to is someone who's familiar with scientific research, but not so familiar with your exact field or your specific lab's focus. And so a good way to explain your research to these people is to try to find something they understand about research and then ground their understanding of your research in that. For my lab, we look at Alzheimer's and dementia research. Pretty much everybody knows about the significance of Alzheimer's and dementia. So I'll usually start with that to kind of like paint a clear picture in their head of the goal of my lab. And then so after I've grounded their understanding in that, then I can go into the more complex systems and like our methodology for doing that. If you're at a conference specific for your field, you'll probably talk to a lot of people that are actual experts in your field. So research scientists that are researching the same things you are. With these people, it's not so much about trying to teach them what you're doing. It's more about trying to get their feedback and use their expertise to help your study. This is often, it can be intimidating because they can ask you very complex questions that you won't really understand. And when this happens, it's not such a bad thing to say, I don't know, or I'm not sure. A lot of the time, if some scientist is saying like, oh, shouldn't you have done your study this way? Or do you think it'd be better to do this? I'm not sure if that's the best idea. They just want you to ask them what they think. It's not a bad thing to say, I'm not sure about that. I think you have a point though. What do you think I should do for this part of my study? Also, talking to your PI and grad students about kind of the bigger picture with your research, like why is it significant that we're researching this right now? What kind of discoveries led to this field of research? And that way, when you meet people from other areas of the field, you have kind of a bigger picture knowledge to talk to them about. So now we're going to have another survey question where what's an area of your research that you'd like to become more familiar with? Something that an expert might ask you at a conference that you would want to brush up on before you go.
Okay, so I'll kind of answer this one again. People in my lab are starting to look at DED1, the protein we study, in these aggregates that form in the cell in the presence of certain conditions called stress granules. And so I don't know too much about these structures, and I read about them in a paper from time to time, but they involve work that's beyond my project right now. So I don't know much about what's happening with them, and I'd like to know more about.
One area of my research that I want to learn more about is in my lab, they do a lot of MRI analysis. So use MRI as an outcome measure. And when I talk to people about it, I basically just have to say what the grad student said, like if it worked or not, because I don't know a whole lot about MRI analysis. So that's something that I want to learn more about.